England once crowned a 9-year-old because his father lost the crown jewels in quicksand. But the crisis began with a woman everyone expected to call king. If one century gave us civil war, a murdered archbishop, and the first blueprint for constitutional law, how did it stay almost forgotten? Journey from Empress Matilda's shattered coronation to the ink-sealing Magna Carta, and discover the century that reinvented power. England's king bled out from a plate of fish, and his last order was ignored before the blood dried. Never did a king leave the realm so full of gold and so empty of heirs. The parchment will matter less than the fastest horse in Normandy. It began not with a sword but with a fish. December 1st, 1135, hunting lodge at Lyons-la-Forêt, Normandy, modern-day France. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a quiet lodge tucked within the Norman woods, far from London's clamour or Westminster's marble throne. The old king, Henry I, lay dying in silence. And he died as he had ruled, alone, decisive, and prepared to the end. He had outlived his brothers. He had outlasted his rivals. He had crushed rebellions and cowed barons. And yet he had not outlived fortune. Henry I, youngest son of William the Conqueror, was no warrior king like his father or son. He ruled with numbers and parchments, not swords. They called him Beauclerk Henry the Scholar. He wasn't just literate in Latin. He could recite Roman law, balance a treasury, and write charters with his own hand. Founded the Exchequer, a royal accounting office with a physical checkered table to calculate revenue and tax. Doubled royal income through rigid tax assessments and fines. Estimated annual revenue, £24,000, extraordinary for the time. Kept detailed financial records, the pipe rolls, some of which still survive, making him one of the most documented early medieval rulers. He was the first English king to truly rule rather than merely reign. And yet, his dynasty stood on a precipice. Henry's only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, had drowned 15 years earlier on November 25, 1120, in the White Ship disaster off Barfla. The ship, overloaded with wine and young nobility, hit a submerged rock and sank. William, just 17, was the last to die. Chronicles say he returned to the freezing channel in a lifeboat to rescue his half-sister, but his boat capsized under the weight of desperation. With that, 17 heirs to English noble houses perished. But only one name truly mattered: William Adelin. The sea had swallowed the future. Henry remarried, desperate for another male heir. His second wife, Adeliza of Louvain, bore him no children. So in 1126, and again in 1131, Henry forced his barons, some under veiled threats, others under outright coercion, to swear an oath to recognize Matilda, his only surviving legitimate child, as queen. She wasn't merely his daughter. She was also the widowed Empress of the Holy Roman Empire and wife to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, her father's political enemy. And so Henry made England swear loyalty to a woman who had never ruled a kingdom alone, was disliked by many English barons for her imperial pride, had married into the very house Normandy had spent generations warring against. Never did a king leave the realm so full of gold and so empty of heirs. William of Malmesbury, Historia Novella, circa 1136. The final act was grotesquely mundane. According to multiple chronicles, Henry died from a surfeit of lampreys, an eel-like delicacy he refused to give up despite his doctor's warnings. It wasn't poison. It wasn't battle. It was pride, appetite, and fate. As he collapsed, the crown did not pass smoothly. It paused. It waited. It listened for the sound of galloping hooves. On his deathbed, Henry's oaths, meticulously drawn in duplicate and sealed by the Church, were supposed to guide succession like gospel. But parchment is no match for politics. And oaths fade faster than memory when the throne is empty. The parchment mattered less than the fastest horse in Normandy. While messengers rode for Matilda, Stephen of Blois rode for London. And London would listen to the man who arrived first. No crown ever came so close to resting on a woman's head, only to vanish in the roar of a city's anger. Mid-June 1141, London, England, a city both throne and tinderbox. It is midsummer. King Stephen is in chains. The capital lies open. And Matilda of England, daughter of a king, widow of an emperor, prepares to take the throne. The clergy draft the formal rites. Barons gather to affirm her claim. The coronation venue, Westminster Abbey, the same sacred place where every English monarch since Edward the Confessor had been crowned. The royal robes are said to be waiting. So is the archbishop. But the crown does not descend. Instead, the city itself rises. Matilda entered London not as a supplicant, but as a monarch in waiting. She refused compromise. She dismissed petitions. She demanded heavy taxation to pay her soldiers at a time when London had just endured siege and famine. She refused to pardon Stephen's supporters. She ignored church pleas for restraint. But the deeper offense? She commanded, not pleaded. And England had never seen a woman wield power that way before. Chronicler William of Malmesbury wrote, "She alienated even those who had welcomed her by her insufferable pride." Was she arrogant? Or merely behaving as any man would, only to be judged by a different standard? On or around June 24, 1141, the people of London, led by merchant guilds, incited by clergy loyal to Stephen, rebel. Bells ring the alarm. Streets fill with chants. The abbey is blockaded. The Lady of the English flees under cover of night, escorted through back alleys and out the gates. No coronation. No crown. No glory. If you think the story of English kings is predictable, this next hour will prove you completely wrong. Subscribe now, and prepare to witness the century England tried to erase. She came with banners and left with curses at her back. The last time a monarch fled a coronation in England? Never. Matilda became the only English monarch designate to be ejected by popular revolt before coronation. No anointing. No crown. No memory carved in gold. Instead, Stephen, her enemy, prisoner just weeks earlier, would regain momentum and ultimately the throne. Her failure at London wasn't just symbolic. It shifted everything. No physical crown had been made for her. Coronation rites would have reused Stephen's regalia. The tax she demanded was said to be 10 times the customary London levy. She allegedly ordered the arrest of Geoffrey de Mandeville, causing panic among other nobles. She issued charters in London under the title Anglorum Domina, but they were quickly voided after her retreat. Some nobles secretly sent word to Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, inviting her return. She lost a crown without ever touching it. And worse, she taught her enemies how to take it back. As Matilda escaped London, her rival's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, was already riding south with an army of her own. 2 women, 1 throne, and no rules left. The crown sat on no head. The throne belonged to no one. And so England burned. England had no king. And worse, it had too many lords. It is the year 1142. The streets of London have cast out Matilda. Stephen has returned from captivity. And the kingdom, if it can still be called that, hangs by the brittle thread of grudging truces and empty oaths. This is no longer a war for a throne. It is a slow, choking erosion of everything a country needs to survive. The fighting has changed. Gone are the great armies in the field, the banners fluttering over castle sieges. The war now is quieter and far more dangerous. Nobles, unrestrained by law, begin to build their own fortresses. Unauthorized castles adulterine, they were called, rose like weeds across England. In valleys, on trade routes, along river crossings. Not in the name of king or empress, but for the lords themselves. They ruled like warlords. Justice ceased. Coins were clipped. Roads were unsafe. No one collected taxes because there was no royal court left to remit them to. And so the only thing that flowed freely through England now was violence and fear. They said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep. The Peterborough Chronicle, c. 1143. This single line, written by a monk in the Midlands, captures what court records could not. A spiritual despair so widespread and so deep that people no longer believed God was watching. It wasn't just famine. It wasn't just lawlessness. It was the feeling that no one was coming. No king. No protector. Not even a divine one. In the absence of power, fear took its place. Men were taken from their fields and pressed into militia bands or forced to pay for their lives with the last of their harvest. Villagers were hanged on trees beside roads, left as warnings by bandits who now called themselves knights. Merchants paid triple for escorts and still vanished between cities. Even churches weren't safe. Priests were dragged from pulpits, altars were robbed, and monasteries were burned because someone heard rumor that a rival's grain was hidden in the granary. There were no rules. There were no lines left to cross. And the worst part? No one remembered who they were fighting for anymore. This wasn't war in the old sense, 2 armies, 1 crown. It was feudal entropy. Local lords switched allegiances week to week. One month they supported Stephen. The next Matilda. Then they renounced both and declared themselves custodians of their own fiefdoms. Some minted their own coins. Thin discs of debased silver, stamped not with the image of a monarch, but with symbols: a tower, a lion, a sword, like tribal banners on a battlefield long since forgotten. Castles were no longer built for defense against enemies. They were built to imprison the very people who farmed the land. They were dens for extortion, ransom, and ritualized cruelty. This wasn't governance. It was feudal hostage-taking. The common people, those who built the churches, tilled the land, sold the bread, had no allegiance left to give. The crown had become a ghost, and every baron had become a tyrant. Meanwhile, Matilda sat in Oxford. Her cause was not dead, not yet, but her grip on the south was eroding. Stephen, though king in name, could not impose law even within his own court. His authority stretched no further than the length of the sword he wore on his hip. By 1143 it was clear. This was not a civil war. This was an unraveling. Even the church, that last unbroken pillar of medieval order, began to beg for peace. Bishops from York and Winchester convened councils. They called on Christendom to cease its cannibalism. They threatened excommunications. They preached mercy. But no one listened. Why would they? No oaths were worth the parchment they were written on. Not anymore. There were places in England between 1142 and 1145 where no king's law had been spoken for years. In the west, along the Welsh marches, entire counties operated as petty kingdoms. In the north, Scottish raiders moved across the border unopposed. In the east, near Ely, local militias formed to protect trade routes, functioning as vigilante governments. And in the south, crops failed not because of drought, but because men no longer dared to leave their homes to plow. In some towns, coins disappeared entirely. People bartered with meat, cloth, and salt as if the clock had been turned back 400 years. And all the while, both Matilda and Stephen sent letters to Rome claiming to be defenders of order. They each promised the Pope that their enemy was the cause of England's ruin. But the truth? Neither ruled England. They merely presided over its disintegration. Still, in a quiet court in Anjou, there was a boy, Henry Fitz-Empress, the son of Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou. 11 years old. He had been watching, studying, writing to the Pope even as a child. Raised on stories of betrayal and siege and exile, he would not be like his mother. He would not lose London. And when the time came, he would cross the sea, not to make a claim, but to end the war entirely. There was no peace in the land, but he who had the most power did the most wrong. Justice Stephanie c. 1145. That, perhaps, was the truest account of the anarchy. When her crown slipped from her grasp, it was Robert who kept the enemies at bay. And when he died, she let it go. The year is 1147. It has been 12 years since Henry I's death, 7 years since the Battle of Lincoln, 6 since Matilda was chased from London without a crown. And still the war drags on, not through grand battles, but through attrition, stone by stone, acre by acre. Robert of Gloucester is now in his 50s, an old man by medieval standards. But more than any other figure in this war, he has endured. He has never worn a crown. He has never claimed a title. But for over a decade, he has been the iron spine of Matilda's cause. He was illegitimate and natural son of Henry I, born not in marriage but in royal indulgence. Yet he was no bastard in character. Raised at court, educated with princes, married well, and made Earl of Gloucester, he commanded vast estates stretching across western England and into Wales. While Matilda claimed legitimacy, Robert commanded loyalty. He had fought at Lincoln, led the siege at Winchester, and when Matilda fled, it was Robert who stayed to be captured, knowing full well that his exchange was the only thing that would free her. No one had more to lose, and no one lost more for her. In late 1147, Robert fell ill, not in battle, not by sword or siege, but in Bristol, the very city he had turned into Matilda's stronghold. His cause had not been defeated, but he was exhausted. Years of war had taken their toll. He died quietly, surrounded by monks. No chronicle records his final words. No bard sang his passing. But the silence that followed was deafening. Robert's death was not a defeat in war, it was a strategic death blow. Matilda had always been a claimant in name. Robert had been her power in action. She was the heir. He was the general. He was the diplomat, the strategist, the one man who could command barons who otherwise refused to follow a woman. And with him gone, there was no longer a second act for Matilda's claim. Her sword was gone. Her shield was broken. And the throne was no longer hers to reach. Sometime shortly after Robert's death, Matilda left England for the last time. She crossed the Channel not in exile but in acceptance. She would never be queen. She would never rule from Westminster. She would never wear the circlet her father had preserved for her. But she had one final act to play as a mother. She had a son, Henry Fitz-Empress. And from this moment forward, she poured every fragment of her ambition into him. Though he died quietly, Robert of Gloucester's influence outlasted almost every man of his time. He had unified scattered barons under Matilda's banner, held Bristol longer than any royalist, negotiated her survival when politics failed, taught his nephew Henry what loyalty cost and why it mattered. It was no coincidence that when Henry landed in England later that same year, he came not with grand claims or arrogant decrees, but with something rarer, a plan. Robert was not crowned. He was not sainted. He was not feared. But when Matilda lost him, she knew the crown would never be hers. And so, she gave it to her son not in ceremony but in silence. The crown has no candidate now. Matilda has withdrawn. Stephen still sits uneasy. And into this vacuum steps a teenager with an empire behind him. Next episode, the boy returns Henry Fitz-Empress and the gamble of 1147. Would you like to continue directly into Henry's first, failed, campaign, and how his debut shaped the myth of the man who would become Henry II? With Robert of Gloucester dead, Matilda laid down her banner. But a boy picked it up. and in the most dangerous year of the war he came to England alone. The year is 1147. Matilda has left for Normandy. Stephen is still King of England in name, but nothing like in command. The kingdom, such as it is, lies broken, strewn with castles like bones across a battlefield. But now the war has a new figure. A teenage boy who has never ruled, never fought a campaign, never held a sword in battle. Yet by the time he turns 20, he will become the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. But not yet. Popular histories treat Henry Fitz-Empress's rise as inevitable. That is the great myth. Because he would one day be Henry II, because he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, because he ruled half of France. It's too easy to forget just how fragile his first appearance was. His first campaign in England was a disaster. But like all great stories of power, the rise begins in defeat. Henry Fitz-Empress, born March 5, 1133 in Le Mans, Anjou. Son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet. Grandson of Henry I. Named after an empire he had never seen. He was raised not at an English court, but in the hard, fractious courts of Anjou and Normandy. From the age of 9 he was taught by warriors, clerks, and monks that he was not just a noble, he was a future king of England. And not because of ambition but because of blood. He was known for a violent energy even in childhood. Restless, strategic, brilliant, prone to outbursts but always capable of seeing beyond them. At just 14 years old, Henry launched his first military expedition to England. That fact alone stuns modern audiences, a child mounting a campaign to reclaim a kingdom lost before he could even walk. He landed near the south coast with a small band of mercenaries, paid not by barons nor by the church, but by his mother and what remained of her dwindling treasury. It was reckless. Some said it was madness. But it was also calculated. He wanted to test the waters, to see who would rally, to claim his inheritance not by right but by presence. And nobody came. The barons watched, but they did not move. Stephen's forces remained alert. The church kept silent. And within months Henry had run out of money. With nothing left to pay his troops, Henry did what no Plantagenet had done before. He begged. Here is where the history veers toward myth and where it demands correction. When Henry could no longer support his campaign, he crossed into France and asked his enemy King Louis VII for aid. Louis, at that time married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, was no friend of the Angevins. And yet he agreed to fund Henry's return home. Not because he admired him. Not because he feared him. But because even Louis, even then, recognized something in the boy, a ferocious clarity. An intelligence that was already hardening into something rare. This was not yet a king. But it was already a force. Why include this botched expedition at all? Because in it Henry learned everything that his mother did not. Matilda had demanded loyalty through rights, titles, and justice. Henry would buy it through presents, speed, rewards, and fear. Matilda had waited for the world to recognize her legitimacy. Henry would create his own inevitability through relentless action. This failure taught him that legitimacy was not inherited. It was performed. He returned to Normandy humiliated, but not broken. In fact, he returned with something else, focus. And not long after, his father died, and Henry inherited Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, 3 territories at the core of the Angevin heartlands. At just 17 he was now a prince in more than name. Backed by his new resources, Henry did what Matilda could never quite manage. He became the first Plantagenet to offer a vision beyond vengeance. He began building alliances with barons who had long grown tired of Stephen's weak hand. He sent envoys to English monasteries, framing his return not just as a royal claim, but as a promise of restored order. And when, in 1150, he took control of Normandy from his father, he secured something Matilda never had: a base of power, respected by both nobles and merchants. He didn't ask for England. He began to surround it. A boy who landed in England too young, too soon, and with too little, returns to Normandy with everything he needs. All he has to do now is wait. Next episode, the pact that ended the anarchy. The Treaty of Winchester, 1153. By 1153, England had endured nearly 2 decades of war. But when the final clash came, it wasn't on the battlefield. It was across a river, between 2 armies that refused to fight. The standoff at Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester are frequently presented in textbooks as the moment peace broke through. As if 2 wise men, King Stephen and Henry Fitz-Empress, simply came to terms and handed power over like gentlemen. But that's a myth. The truth is more human, more tragic, and more revealing. It is July, the fields are green and damp, the Thames wide and sluggish in the heat. On one side of the river, Stephen's army, camped near the town of Wallingford. On the other, Henry's holding the northern bank. They had skirmished before. But this time something strange happened. The barons refused to charge. What? Not out of loyalty. Not out of fear. They were simply done. These knights had fought each other for years, some had switched sides 2, even 3 times. Many were related. Some had buried sons on both banks of this river. And now they stood facing each other, shields in hand, and lowered them. A war that had begun with oaths and crowns was now a war of exhaustion. And this standoff, this refusal to kill, was the most powerful gesture of all. What truly broke Stephen wasn't the field at Wallingford. It was the death of his son. Eustace, his heir, died suddenly in August 1153, just weeks after the standoff. Most chroniclers say it was fever. Others, more dramatically, claimed divine judgment for his opposition to Henry's claim. But what mattered was this: Stephen had no more reason to fight. Eustace had been raised to inherit. He had been crowned junior king in a desperate bid to solidify Stephen's dynasty. But now he was gone, and with him, the thread that had tied Stephen's pride to the war. He had already lost his wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, the lioness who once led his armies. Now his son. What is a crown? Stephen must have asked himself. If you wear it alone. It was not written in triumph. There was no grand ceremony, no cheering crowds. It was an act of reluctant mercy, a peace forged not through strength, but the mutual understanding that nothing was left to win. Here is what it declared. Stephen would remain king for life. Henry Fitz-Empress would be named his adopted heir. Stephen's remaining son, William, would be excluded from succession but allowed to keep his estates. The barons, for the first time in 2 decades, swore loyalty to a peaceful future, not to a person. This treaty was negotiated not by kings but by their allies, particularly Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury, who maneuvered both men toward the only thing more powerful than ambition: weariness. Why does this matter more than any battle? Because this is where the nature of English monarchy changes. Until now, the crown had been a possession held by force, transferred by oaths, lost through failure. But at Winchester, something new was born: the idea that a monarch's authority could be passed not by blood or brute strength, but by agreement. It was the first peaceful succession of its kind in England since the Norman conquest. And it would echo into Magna Carta, the baronial rebellions, and ultimately the very idea of limited monarchy. The war ended not because Stephen lost, but because he let it go. And in doing so he did something Matilda never could. He walked away from the crown willingly. By the time the treaty was signed, Henry Fitz-Empress was 20 years old. He held Anjou, Normandy, and Maine. He had married Eleanor of Aquitaine the year before, gaining the largest duchy in France. Now he stood one step from the throne of England. He had not conquered it. He had waited for it to fall into his hands. And Stephen, a man broken by grief, whose reign began in ambition and ended in exhaustion, handed it to him. The crown had devoured a generation, and so they buried the war in silence. No victory songs, no parades, only a treaty and a breath of peace. But peace never lasts, because now a new king was coming. A king who did not inherit just a throne. He inherited a broken kingdom, and the expectation that he would fix it. The treaty has been signed, the swords have been sheathed, and the crown lies in waiting. But the hand that still wears it, Stephen's, is growing colder. This is a moment that's often flattened in traditional accounts. The peaceful transition, the natural succession. A convenient full stop at the end of England's darkest civil war. But history, as always, is messier, more human. Stephen died with a crown on his head and nothing in his hands. It is late 1154. The Treaty of Winchester has held for just under a year. The fighting has stopped. No new sieges, no shifting allegiances. The land breathes again, but only barely. Stephen is still king in name. But everyone, including Stephen himself, knows that he is only keeping the throne warm. Many summaries offer a sterile, satisfying sentence. Stephen died in 1154 and was succeeded peacefully by Henry II. This is true, but it is hollow. It misses the long sigh of history and the deeper truth that the transition from Stephen to Henry wasn't just about peace. It was about fatigue, about letting go, about what it means to lose everything but still perform duty until the end. What's lost in most retellings? Stephen's emotional disintegration after the death of his son Eustace. The quiet hostility from remaining loyalists who resented Henry's rise. The fact that this was the first peaceful succession in 100 years, and no one knew how to act. The immense symbolic pressure on Henry to do what neither Matilda nor Stephen could. Restore not just the crown, but trust in the crown. So let's re-enter this story, not from a coronation chamber but from Dover, where a king was dying. He died at Dover Castle, on the coast, as if he were already halfway out of England. Not in battle, not in ceremony, but in silence. The chroniclers tell us little. A sudden illness, possibly a rupture or bleeding in the stomach. More than one monk records that he spoke little at the end. He had buried his wife, buried his heir, buried his ambition. And now he would be buried too at Faversham Abbey, beside Eustace and Queen Matilda. A modest grave for a man who had once fought half of England for a throne. He ruled like a soldier. He died like a ghost. The Gesta Stephanie final entry. There was no national mourning, no grand procession. The realm did not weep, but it exhaled. And just like that, Henry Fitz-Empress became Henry II without drawing a sword. A transition as clean as parchment. But don't mistake quiet for simple. This moment was radical. Never before in England had a king been acknowledged in advance, without inheritance or conquest. There had been usurpations, like Stephen's own rise, and conquests, William the Conqueror, and posthumous acclamations. But this was a negotiated transfer of sovereign authority, backed not by divine right or direct bloodline, but by mutual agreement. A political evolution forged in the ashes of civil war. The nobility did not erupt in celebration. The church offered blessings, but with caution. Commoners, if they noticed at all, simply hoped the killing was finally over. But for Henry, now just 21 years old, the real war was only beginning. He inherited a monarchy stripped of dignity, nobles fat with castles and independence, a treasury drained to embers, a peasantry suspicious of every lord, every tax, every command. There were over 300 adulterine castles built illegally during the Anarchy. Dozens of barons believed they could keep their own laws, now that they'd tasted autonomy. To sit on the throne was not to rule. It was merely to begin rebuilding trust in the very idea of monarchy. Henry was not stepping into peace. He was stepping into a vacuum. But he came with something his mother never had: control. Not just of land Anjou, Normandy, Aquitaine through his new marriage to Eleanor, but of his own court, his own treasury, and his own message. He arrived not to ask permission to rule, but to announce that the age of warlords was over, and within months he would begin dismantling private castles, reforming coinage, reasserting royal justice in regions untouched by law for years. But all of that, the renaissance of royal power, comes later. This moment in late 1154 is about a simple truth. The crown passed, and for the first time in living memory, no one died for it. The death of Stephen and the accession of Henry II mark more than just a dynastic shift. They mark a foundational moment in English constitutional memory. That rule can transfer peacefully. That a king can surrender the throne voluntarily. That a generation of chaos can give way to structure. And that structure, once born, would become the stage upon which every future monarch in rebellion would stand. Stephen was buried without fanfare. Henry was crowned without contest. The war was over. The work was just beginning. He did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a broken machine, dented, rusted, abandoned in a field of ruins. And he set about rebuilding it with the only tools he trusted: iron, ink, and order. It is late 1154. Henry II, just 21 years old, is crowned at Westminster. But he does not linger. He is a king in motion. Traditional retellings of Henry's early reign focus heavily on administrative reform: royal circuits, sheriffs, coinage, and scutage. These are important. But told alone, they obscure the scale of what Henry was attempting. He wasn't just restoring royal power. He was nationalizing authority. He wasn't just fixing systems. He was reprogramming the relationship between king and people, crown and land, crime and justice. And he wasn't doing it from a stable court. He was doing it while ruling the largest realm in Western Europe, an empire not claimed by conquest, but by marriage, inheritance, and delicate aggression. So let us begin with the first pillar of that power: law. From 1154 onward, Henry II unleashed a revolution in governance, not by building new structures but by moving them. He reintroduced itinerant royal justices, circuit judges who traveled England hearing local cases, imposing royal decisions, collecting fines. This wasn't new. But under Henry it became a machine. Within 5 years, Henry had set up circuits that covered nearly every shire. Every freeman, every serf, every baron had the chance, however narrow, to appeal directly to the king's law. For the first time since Edward the Confessor, ordinary people began to see royal justice not as a rumor, but as a visit. To pay for this, Henry revived and expanded the sheriff system, putting royal officers in counties to collect taxes and enforce rulings. And in place of feudal military service, he introduced a new tax: scutage, literally money in place of a shield. If a baron didn't want to provide knights, he could pay a fee instead. This sounds dull, but it changed everything. It meant Henry could hire professionals, raise armies when and where he wanted, and no longer rely on nobles who might be tempted to rebel again. Justice, coinage, taxation reform was Henry's war, and he fought it on every front. Henry's genius wasn't just in what he built. It was in how he sold it. He didn't call these innovations new laws. He called them restorations. He told the barons and the church that he was reviving the good laws of his grandfather Henry I. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a restorer. But in truth, he was remaking the kingdom in his own image. But while Henry restructured England, his power was not rooted only in the island. Let us now turn to the most powerful decision he ever made and one of the most controversial unions in medieval Europe. In 1152, 2 years before he became king, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was 11 years his senior. She had been married to King Louis VII of France, and divorced him after 15 years. She was queen, duchess, mother, and most dangerously, still sovereign in her own right. Aquitaine, her dowry, was vast, stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees. With Normandy and Anjou already under Henry's control, this marriage created a realm so large it dwarfed the lands of the French king himself. This was not just a marriage. It was a geopolitical bomb. The French crown had tried to hold Eleanor close for years. Now she was in the hands of a Plantagenet. Together, Henry and Eleanor ruled from the Scottish border to the Mediterranean. No monarch in Europe commanded so much land. No couple in Europe held so much volatile power. And it was volatile. The term Angevin Empire is a modern one. Contemporaries never called it that. And for good reason. It was not a unified empire. It was a collection of personal holdings held through marriage, war, diplomacy, and inheritance. England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Aquitaine, even parts of Ireland would come later. Henry didn't rule these lands from a capital. He ruled them from horseback. He crossed the Channel constantly, issued charters in 3 languages, married off his children to claim more ground. And when barons resisted, he summoned them not to parliaments, but to war. This was monarchy as motion, empire as energy. And Eleanor matched him. She governed Aquitaine in her own name. She traveled. She ruled. She bore 8 children, including 3 future kings. She wrote letters with the flourish of a ruler, not a consort. Together they were formidable. But together they were also impossible. Though this episode is about Henry's rise, we cannot ignore what is already beginning to simmer. Henry's rule is relentless. He demands obedience. He centralizes power. He outworks, outthinks, and when necessary outpunishes. But Eleanor? She does not fade. She will not be a shadow queen. And as their children grow, especially Richard and Henry the young king, the stage is being set for the greatest familial implosion in medieval royal history. But not yet. For now, in the 1150s and early 1160s, Henry's authority is unchallenged. The legal reforms are working. The castles are coming down. The taxes are flowing. The barons are shrinking back into compliance. And the crown has never stood so tall. Stephen won the crown through war. Henry kept it through work. His reforms weren't just governance. They were revenge against the chaos of his childhood. Against the war that nearly ruined the country that was now his. He had married power. He had enforced law. And he had restored the monarchy not with ceremony, but with spreadsheets, tax rolls, and judicial circuits. But in Henry's world, power never rests. And it never forgives. England's barons thought the war was over. Henry thought it had just begun. No sword was raised, no crown lost, and yet the ground trembled. For Henry Plantagenet was building something England had never seen. A monarchy made not of lineage but of law. When Henry first wore the crown, the barons watched closely. They had seen kings come and go. They had held castles through sieges and sat at council tables dripping with blood. Many of them had fought for Stephen. A few had betrayed Matilda. Most had simply survived. They expected Henry to ask for loyalty. He didn't. He demanded obedience. The message came not by herald but by stone mason. Across the kingdom, royal agents began marking castles for demolition, adulterine strongholds built during the Anarchy without royal permission. Hundreds were torn down. No exceptions. No negotiations. Stone crumbled. Walls fell. And with them, the last illusion that the barons were anything more than tenants of the king. He allowed them titles. He allowed them land. But he took from them the right to rule their own domains like kings. Beside Henry, always at his right hand, rode Thomas Becket, son of a London merchant. educated in Paris, quick of wit and cold of ambition. Henry made him chancellor in 1155, and the two became as close as any king and minister could be. They hunted together, laughed like brothers, shared wine, shared secrets. But while Henry ruled by decree, it was Becket who carried the ledger. It was Becket who enforced scutage, the tax levied in place of military service. If a noble owed the king knights and failed to send them, Becket turned up with parchment in one hand and a bill in the other. He wrung the purse, one chronicler wrote, like a man wringing the neck of a goose. The barons hated him, but they feared Henry more, and so they paid. Far to the south, Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled not as queen but as duchess. Her seal bore her own name. Her officials answered to her, not Henry. She had been Queen of France before she became Queen of England, and she never forgot the difference. Aquitaine, her inheritance, was vast, bigger than any French royal holding. Its rivers carried salt and wine. Its hills bled silver. Its ports fed fleets. And every year, it funded Henry's reforms in England. Henry's castles were paid for with Eleanor's revenues. His justice rode on her roads. His sheriffs were armed by her coin. And yet she remained apart. Neither servant nor equal. A partner, and perhaps one day a rival. But that day had not yet come. By now Henry's machine of government was running hot. Royal judges rode across the countryside, enforcing king's law in every corner. Sheriffs collected taxes without delay. Barons paid. Clergy paid. Even bishops bent the knee. But one thing still escaped his grasp: the church's money. At Woodstock, Henry declared that sheriffs, not abbots, would collect the lucrative sheriff's aid, a local tax paid annually to support the king's traveling court. The clergy bristled. But none more than the man Henry had once trusted above all others. For in 1162, Henry had made Thomas Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. It was meant to be a masterstroke. Place your closest ally atop the church and you control the altar as you do the throne. But Becket had changed. He wore plain robes now, ate with monks, slept little. He refused royal demands, questioned royal policies. And at Woodstock he opposed the king's tax. "You made me what I am," Becket said quietly, "and now I must be what I was made to be." It wasn't just disobedience. It was betrayal. The chancellor had become a cleric. The hammer had turned against the hand that forged it. In the months that followed, the relationship collapsed. Henry, furious, began drafting laws to limit ecclesiastical independence. Becket refused to enforce them. Courtiers whispered. Bishops wavered. The barons, once the targets of royal justice, now watched with morbid interest as the king turned on his own. All of Henry's reforms, his courts, his taxes, his sheriffs had made him powerful. But none of them prepared him for a foe who would not bend. Not because he was stronger, but because he was willing to break. Henry had crushed rebellion. He had dismantled the baronage. He had turned parchment into a sword. But in Becket he faced something else. A man who no longer feared the king's wrath, because he had already cast aside everything the king could take. Next episode, the blood in the cathedral, the murder of Thomas Becket, and the crown's darkest hour. A king can mint coin from silver. Thomas Becket minted power from charm. Thomas was born around 1120 in Cheapside, son of Gilbert Becket, a middling draper whose stall smelled of wool oil and raw ambition. London's merchants were England's most innovative mathematicians. Thomas absorbed their craft. He could parse an account faster than a monk could copy a psalm. Yet he also learned calculation of a subtler kind. When to tip the porter, when to laugh at the alderman's joke, when to bury insult beneath polish. These two talents, arithmetic and allure, carried him to the household of Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury. Theobald, that spider primate of English ecclesiastical politics, sent the young clerk to Bologna and Auxerre, where canon law was discussed the way knights discuss swordsmanship. By 25, Thomas could argue a point of decretals while spotting a forged tally stick at 50 paces. But he was still only a clerk. Early 1154, Henry Fitz-Empress arrives from Anjou to claim a kingdom that is his by treaty but not yet by habit. The court buzzes with itinerant nobles, hostile sheriffs, unpaid mercenaries. Theobald presents Becket, now his archdeacon, to the new king. Henry expects deference. He receives conversation. Becket speaks of hawking along the Seine, quotes Horace without apology, wagers he can best Henry at chess, loses gracefully, then wins the rematch by moving the king's rook while distracting Henry with a story about Picardy wine. It is the first time since childhood, Henry later confesses, that anyone has made him laugh and think in the same breath. The king, who prizes useful men, recognizes a man whose usefulness is limitless. Within months, Becket is named Lord Chancellor of England not because he is a priest, but because he can read the room and the revenue scroll with equal fluency. Historians often pass over the chancellorship as a prelude to the real drama. That is their error. For 7 years, England saw Becket not as martyr, but as magnate draped in scarlet, leading hunting parties, commanding a personal retinue of 200 knights funded from chancery profits. He wore fur at midsummer, hosted banquets where eels swam in almond milk, and tossed silver to minstrels with the flourish of a duke. Was it vanity? Partly. But it was strategy more formidable than any siege engine. England had just endured 20 years of famine and ransacked villages. Becket's ostentation announced that the crown was solvent again, that money flowed, that peace paid dividends. Coins bearing Henry's profile jangled on oak tables. Charters sealed with Becket's coiled tea left Westminster by the sackful. The message to barons was blunt. The king rewards obedience with gold and charges disobedience in kind. Scutage, that unloved levy in lieu of military service, doubled under Becket's hand. He toured shires to collect arrears in person, arriving with jesters and trumpets, then emptying the great chests of delinquent earls. Chroniclers who would later praise his sanctity were, at this point, calling him the king's new taxman. Yet even his victims admitted he was fair. He recorded every debt in duplicate, credited every overpayment, accepted barns of grain in lieu of coin during bad harvest years. He made the barons curse him without ever quite despising him, a balance Henry himself struggled to achieve. The zenith of their friendship arrives when Henry invades Toulouse to secure Eleanor's continental border. Becket rides at the king's side in gilt armor paid from his own coffers, banner stitched with archiepiscopal keys, a small heresy winked away in the thrill of advance. When Henry hesitates before a French-held gate, Louis VII is rumored inside and royal blood cannot be shed by royal hand. Becket volunteers to storm the city himself. The king calls him back, but the gesture sparks legend. A cleric ready to fight like Achilles for his liege. Later writers will claim this was bravado, but Henry cherished it. A counselor who acts. Priceless. By campaign's end, Henry owes Becket more than loyalty. He owes him triumph. And it is here the seeds of future discord are sown. For the king, convinced no boundary exists between Becket's will and his own, decides to place him upon the highest clerical throne in England. June 1162. Archbishop Theobald is dead. Henry wants an archbishop who will keep the church pliant. His council expects the usual political horse trading. Instead, Henry nominates Becket. Contemporary clerics gasp in delight, in horror. A chancellor who levies taxes upon monks will now hear their confessions? Becket himself resists, so the chroniclers say. Some declare he told the king, "If I become archbishop, we shall hate each other." Whether spoken or not, the warning rang true. Henry, deaf to prophecy, presses. Becket accepts. The king celebrates, thinking he has placed a second crown upon his own head. But the moment the mitre rests on Becket's skull, the weight of its authority fills him in ways Henry never imagined. The lavish chancellor strips down to sackcloth under his robes. The collector of scutage starts remitting debts owed by parishes. He resigns the chancery, breaking the administrative chain that tied him to royal will. What happened? Historians quarrel. One camp claims genuine conversion. Becket, confronted by the sanctuary of Canterbury and the bones of St. Alphege, abandons worldly appetite. Others believe calculation. He realizes at last that only by embodying the church can he rival the king's reach. Whatever the motive, the effect is the same. A partnership forged in laughter hardens into rivalry, then enmity. Spring 1163. Henry expects Becket to rubber-stamp new royal taxes on monastic estates, just as Chancellor Becket once did. Archbishop Becket cites canon law, blocks the levy, and disciplines priests who obey the sheriffs instead of their bishop. Henry fumes. Barons, nursing old grievances, sense an opening. Courtiers whisper, the friendship is broken. Eleanor, miles away in Aquitaine, writes letters urging compromise. She understands what happens when church and crown lock horns. But compromise is not in Henry's blood, and Becket discovers it is no longer in his. The stage is set for Clarendon, exile, swords glinting beneath winter cloaks. But that is tomorrow's chapter. When a king raises a man beyond all others, he imagines gratitude will be eternal. Henry forgot the first rule of power: give a servant 2 crowns and he ceases to be a servant. The anvil's ring fades. A mitre replaces the coin upon the iron. Parchment curls in the heat of a forge no longer needed. And somewhere in Canterbury, Thomas Becket kneels, whispering a prayer Henry will never hear, a prayer that will echo like steel across the realm. The barons feared the king's sheriffs. The king feared no one. Until his friend discovered he feared God more than he feared Henry. A Sussex priest, dead drunk, kills a layman in a tavern fight. Henry orders him hauled before the county court. Becket insists he be tried in an ecclesiastical tribunal. It is a small case, petty homicide, commonplace in a hard land. But Henry seizes it as emblem. These are my subjects, he declares, not Rome's. At Westminster Hall, the king unleashes statistics meaningless but terrifying. 100 felons hide behind the tonsure, he thunders. The real number is fewer than 20. And the barons, smarting from their own losses, nod eagerly. A new enemy presents itself, not themselves at last but the clergy. Becket counters softly. No man can serve 2 masters, Caesar and Christ. It is a line Henry cannot forgive, for it makes him Caesar and unseats him in the same breath. At Clarendon Palace, Henry unrolls parchment 16 clauses that tether every abbot, every bishop, directly to the crown. No appeal to Rome without royal leave. No sanctuary for violent clerks. No ecclesiastical tenant may leave England owing service. Most bishops sign, eyes downcast, quills shaking. They remember adulterine castles collapsing under royal hammers. They remember sheriffs replacing abbots in tax rolls. Becket alone hesitates, then signs, but with a whispered protest to the king's face. 3 days later he recants, pleading conscience. The king's court breaks into laughter and then into fury. Perjury, cry the barons. Henry, red-faced, storms from the hall. England divides overnight. Royalists, barons tired of clerical exemptions, sheriffs hungry for revenue. Thomasines, cathedral chapters, country priests, and villagers who see in Becket a shield against lay tyranny. Henry miscalculates. He expected institutional resistance, not popular veneration. Country folk begin carving small crosses on doorposts saying, "For St. Thomas that he may prevail." Henry summons Becket, charging him with malpractice as chancellor. Mishandled funds, missed rents, tithes diverted. The sums are astronomical, purposefully unpayable. Becket appears in full episcopal regalia, lifts the cross before his face, and declares he will not submit to civil judgment. Witnesses recall the crackling hush when he steps through the hostile court clutching his crucifix, refusing to surrender it even to help open the doors. Guards part. Even barons who hate him swallow hard. That night, Becket slips out disguised as a Benedictine, crosses the estuary in a rain squall, and vanishes into the Kentish marshes destined for France. "I have served my king," he tells two monks at Dover. "Now I must serve the King of Kings." Henry's rage shakes the rafters of Northampton. But the archbishop is gone. Louis VII welcomes Becket like a banner fallen from the heavens. French abbeys house him. Papal legates shuttle letters across the Alps. Becket pours ink instead of blood, excommunications drafted in candlelight, anathemata naming royal sheriffs, charters absolving rebels who shelter clergy. Henry retaliates, confiscates Becket's English estates, banishes his kin 400 souls, some barely weaned across the Channel, threatens to close English ports to any papal envoy carrying Becket's appeals. Yet the king cannot touch him in exile. He cannot invade France, not without tearing his continental flank open to Louis. He tries diplomacy, sending envoys to Rome, but the Pope delays, part sympathy for Becket, part fear of Angevin power. The war becomes a chess match of letters and spiritual sanctions. In 1 year alone, Becket pens more than 200 letters, half admonitions, half absolutions, each a pinprick in the royal hide. Meanwhile, Henry's realm feels the pinch. Mass sacraments stall in dioceses under interdict. Lords marry without church blessing, and rumors spread that none of their heirs will be deemed legitimate. It is spiritual siege warfare, invisible yet suffocating. By 1170 Henry is juggling crises, Welsh unrest, Norman baronial mutterings, and a brewing feud among his own sons. Political calculus overcomes fury. He meets Becket at Fritival. The encounter is stiff, pained, but necessity wins. They kiss one another on the cheek, a gesture chroniclers note felt colder than iron. Henry restores Becket's see. Becket agrees to crown the young King Henry with papal assent, a promise he will not keep. A date is set for the Archbishop's return. England's churches prepare bells. Canterbury's monks scrub the flagstones where their shepherd will tread again. But beneath the surface nothing is resolved. Henry refuses to revoke the Clarendon clauses. Becket refuses to absolve the bishops who enforced them. Each believes the other will bend once the theater of reconciliation is staged. They underestimate how 7 years of narrative martyr in exile versus tyrant king has soaked into England's imagination. The reconciliation fools no one, least of all the 4 knights sharpening their blades at Henry's Christmas court. Becket returns in November. Crowds line the roads, kneel in mud, press infants toward his hands for blessing. Bells peal so wildly a stone angel cracks off the roof of St. Martin's and shatters on the flagstones below, an omen some later claim foreshadowed the shattering to come. Becket's first official act. He excommunicates the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Salisbury for their role in crowning young Henry without Canterbury's approval. It is less a strike at the bishops than a slap at the king's face. Henry is made to watch his own ecclesiastical allies declared damned. When news reaches the royal court at Bears on the Norman Vexin, Henry explodes into the night, words torn from him like sparks off flint. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? Whether these are the exact words hardly matters. What matters is who hears them. 4 knights ride out into the December dark. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, Richard le Bret. No warrant. No royal seal. Only the heat of a monarch's frustration enough to ignite tragedy. Exile had sharpened Becket into a blade. England was the whetstone. Henry forged the tension. The knights would strike the blow, and the echo would outlive them all. A candle guttering beside a quill, boots splashing through winter puddles, Canterbury spires looming against the frost-white moon. The final tragedy waits in the cold. The doors of Canterbury Cathedral closed with the cold behind them. Outside, the rain froze on stone. Inside, something far colder would unfold. This was not an execution. It was not sanctioned by a king. It was something far more terrifying, a moment when words became blood. And England would never again feel certain where power truly lived, on the throne or at the altar. A king lost his patience, for knights lost their souls, and a realm found its conscience too late. Most histories rush this moment like it's inevitable. They say Becket provoked it. They say Henry didn't mean it. They say the knights misinterpreted the king's fury. But as a historian I ask, why did they not hesitate at the cathedral door? Why did they not fear the wrath of heaven or of Rome? Because England in 1170 had become something new. A monarchy so strong, its anger passed for law. That's the real horror. Not that Becket died, but that his death was not immediately unthinkable. Afternoon fades. The cathedral hums with vespers. Monks shuffle through the cloisters, whispering prayers. Becket, robed in white and gold, is told that knights have arrived. He does not flee. Let them come. Here is the house of God. I do not fear to die for justice. The four knights, Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Bret, burst in, armed, sweating, shouting. Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king? Becket answers with a thunderclap. Here I am, no traitor, but a priest of God. It is not a line from legend. It is what the witnesses recorded. They drag him toward the altar. He clings to a pillar, refuses to kneel. They strike once, twice. The third blow splits his skull. His brain spatters the floor of the choir. Edward Grimm, a clerk who tried to shield him, loses part of his arm. The fourth blow is so hard the sword shatters on stone. Let us be gone, one knight mutters. He will rise no more. They leave his body in the dark. A pool of blood, thick, red, and silence spreads beneath the altar. The monks gather around him, stunned. One dips a cloth in the blood. Another cuts a lock of his hair. A third whispers what all are thinking. A saint. He has died like a saint. The horror travels faster than the knights. Within days, England is thunderstruck. Within weeks, all of Christendom knows. Pope Alexander III weeps. French bishops demand excommunication. Miracles begin to be reported at Becket's tomb, cripples walking, fevers breaking, children revived. The Church begins the canonization process almost immediately. 2 years later, in 1173, Becket is declared a saint. But by then the pressure on Henry is already unbearable. At first, Henry denies involvement. He is in Normandy, consumed with political chaos, rebellions from his wife Eleanor and sons, rising baronial unrest. He claims he never meant for Becket to die. But none believe it. The Pope threatens interdict. Rome's silence hardens into the weight of judgment. So in July 1174, Henry crosses the Channel. In sackcloth and barefoot, he walks through the mud and filth of Canterbury streets. He prostrates himself at the cathedral and is whipped by the monks, each lash meant to purge the blood that cried out from beneath the altar. Chroniclers differ on the number. Some say 5 lashes for each of Becket's 5 wounds. Others say 80. But all agree. No king had ever done this. No king had ever needed to. He wept, One wrote, "And all of Christendom saw that kings are made of flesh." Here's where the deeper meaning begins. Did Henry truly feel remorse? Possibly. But even if he did not, his actions show what mattered more: perception. He had to show contrition because Becket's death proved a terrifying truth. When royal wrath becomes divine defiance, even a king must kneel. This moment haunted the monarchy. And here's how. Every future king knew that pushing against the church could end in sainthood for the church and humiliation for the crown. Becket became a weapon. Popes invoked him to check kings. English rebels invoked him to demand justice. His tomb became a rallying point for conscience more feared than any sword. Even Edward I, a century later, when executing a bishop, made sure it was done far from sacred ground. Even Henry VIII, 400 years later, had Becket's bones burned and his shrine obliterated not because he feared the dead, but because he feared what the dead still represented. On the cathedral floor, Henry's greatest minister lay broken. But the monarchy he built did not die with Becket. Instead, it shuddered then stiffened. For kings would not forget the blood in the nave. And neither would England. The candle at the altar guttered in 1170. But its shadow lingered in every courtroom, every sermon, every coronation. The echo of Becket's murder still lingered in the cathedrals and confessionals of England, but outside the holy silence, another storm had begun, one Henry II would not confess to, not even in sackcloth. He had built an empire with parchment and policy. He had tamed barons, outwitted kings, stared down the Pope. But what he could not tame were his own sons. And in the end, the thing that broke Henry wasn't rebellion. It was inheritance. A kingdom divided is dangerous. A royal family divided is fatal. Many accounts of this period describe it as merely the Angevin princes growing restless, impatient heirs grabbing at future crowns. But that's dangerously reductionist. This wasn't about ambition alone. It was about design failure. Henry built his realm like an architect, layered, functional, impressive. But his blueprint for succession was riddled with contradictions. He divided lands among sons but retained all real authority himself. He crowned a living son young king, but gave him no treasury, no court, no army, just a title. He micromanaged governance, yet expected loyalty from boys who saw only delay and humiliation. Let's meet the players not as legends, but as humans Henry underestimated. Henry the young king. Crowned in 1170 alongside his father. Handsome, charismatic, adored by the tournament crowds. But powerless. Crowned with ceremony, given no budget, no dominion. He burned with the contradiction. A king who couldn't rule. Richard of Aquitaine. Fierce, chivalric, a born warrior. Eleanor's favorite, steeped in Aquitanian independence. Guarded his duchy like a knight guarding a relic. Hated being second to a brother with a crown but no land. Geoffrey of Brittany. Clever, caustic, politically gifted. Married into Brittany to extend Angevin reach. Always aware he was the spare. John youngest. Still a child in the early 1170s. Nicknamed Lackland because he had no assigned inheritance. Henry's secret favorite, later to become his final betrayer. In 1173 the tension snapped. Henry the young king fled to the court of Louis VII of France, demanding support. Richard and Geoffrey followed. Eleanor, astonishingly, backed her sons, sending word from Poitiers and possibly even letters to Louis. A mother siding with her sons against her husband. In the 12th century this was not just treason, it was seismic. France, Flanders, and Scotland smelled blood. The rebellion became pan-European. Normandy, castles under siege. Aquitaine, Richard, backed by rebels, tried to hold it independently. Scotland, King William the Lion invaded northern England. England, Barons, still bitter from Henry's reforms, sided with the sons. But Henry's statecraft endured. He divided the rebels, bribed their allies, and critically captured Eleanor. She would spend the next 16 years under house arrest. By 1174, Henry had crushed the rebellion. His eldest son, shamed, was welcomed back at court. But the damage wasn't erased, it was merely postponed. The next act in this dynastic tragedy unfolded in 1183. Still feeling humiliated, still with no real power, Henry the young king rebelled again, this time in Aquitaine, this time against his own brother Richard. But the rebellion collapsed almost instantly. And fate intervened where politics could not. In June 1183, Henry the young king died of dysentery in Martel, France. He was just 28. He died unforgiven. He died without seeing Eleanor again. He died having worn a crown, but never ruled a single village. As he lay dying, he requested the royal cloak he once wore be placed over his body, and a hair shirt beneath penance for a life spent chasing a crown he never held. The death of the young king did not resolve the family conflict. It deepened it. Richard, now the heir, became colder, harder. He never forgave his father's favoritism. Geoffrey, whose territory was overlooked, would seethe until his own death in 1186. John, now older, began scheming for his place in a legacy that had no place for him. And Eleanor? Still imprisoned. Her influence now moved only through whispers and emissaries. This wasn't a royal family. It was a court full of claimants, each with a dagger tucked in their sleeve. And Henry, once the monarch who tamed anarchy, was now a father who'd engineered his own political tragedy. He crowned a son in life only to bury him before death. He mapped an empire, only to watch it splinter beneath his family's feet. Henry II, the architect king, was discovering a truth far older than chanceries. A crown divides faster than it unites, especially among those born to wear it. The body of Henry II was brought to Fontevraud Abbey in silence, his hands folded not in prayer, but in exhaustion. The most powerful monarch of his age, the man who had ruled an empire from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, was laid to rest in the same cloak he wore the day Becket was murdered. But at the moment of his death, no son stood beside him. No court sang his praises. The only thing Henry heard in his final hours was the name of his last betrayal. John. The son he loved most. The one who broke him. He conquered half of France, outwitted the church, tamed barons and built justice, but he could not survive the ambitions of his own blood. He died at Chinon in 1189, succeeded by his son Richard I. But that line buries the collapse of a king who had outlived his own political architecture. The how and why of Henry's downfall are often skipped, either out of fatigue from the family's endless rebellions or in rush to get to the sexier, crusading exploits of Richard the Lionheart. But in those final months lies a bitter, Shakespearean fall, a story of miscalculations, shifting loyalties, and a father broken not by foreign armies, but by his own sons, all of whom he had raised as rivals to each other. 1189, the Angevin Empire is fraying at every seam. Eleanor of Aquitaine, released from prison by the barons after young Henry's death, is back on the political stage, and she's siding with Richard. Richard, now in open rebellion, forms an alliance with King Philip II of France, the same Capetian monarch Henry had spent decades outmaneuvering. John, once the baby of the family, has now defected to Richard's side. The son Henry once called the only one with the guts to rule, becomes the Judas who helps collapse the Angevin court from within. Everywhere Henry turns, former allies crumble, sheriffs defect, and castles fall like dominoes. This isn't a war of armies. It's a war of position, of territory ceded in treaties Henry never intended to honor, of loyalty bought and sold faster than oaths could be spoken. He is not defeated by strength but by momentum. In June 1189, Henry flees Le Mans as Richard and Philip approach. His own household begins to desert him. Ill, fevered, bleeding from a fistula in his jaw, Henry can barely sit a horse. He sues for peace. At the Treaty of Colombiers, he is forced to accept Richard as his heir and acknowledge his continental vassals' demands. As part of the agreement, a list is presented to him, names of those who have joined the rebellion. At the top is John. Henry reads it. He says only, "Now let everything go as it will. I care no more for myself nor for the world." That is not resignation. That is heartbreak. Within days the king's health collapses. He is carried to Chinon Castle in Anjou barely conscious. Chroniclers describe a man who had become unrecognizable, bloated, gray-skinned, half-mad with fever. He raves. He cries out for Becket. He curses his sons in one breath and begs for their forgiveness in the next. On July 6, 1189, Henry II dies unattended by any of his children, his once mighty court scattered. As monks prepare his body, they remove his cloak and discover that beneath it, he is still wearing the hair shirt of penance from his act of atonement at Canterbury. A relic of Becket, still there after all these years. This was not a man who ever forgot what it meant to lose the favor of heaven. Henry's body is brought to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, the planned burial site of the Angevin dynasty. But when his corpse is laid before the high altar, legend says that blood pours from his nose, a sign. Some believed that the traitors who caused his death are near. Richard is already making arrangements to sail for England. John is silent. Eleanor, ever composed, does not attend. The irony could not be crueler. Henry II had built a dynasty on control, strategy, and justice. He died betrayed, disfigured, and spiritually undone. We call him Lionheart. We praise his military brilliance, his crusader glory, his battlefield valor. But in July 1189, Richard Plantagenet became King of England with no interest in England at all. He had spent most of his life in Aquitaine, where he was shaped by troubadours, skirmishes, and Eleanor's courtly culture. He barely spoke English and spent less than 6 months total in England during his entire reign. His first acts as king were not reform, but preparation for war, the Third Crusade, which he would launch within a year. Richard's rise to power was not a coronation of destiny, it was a diplomatic necessity, born from rebellion and dynastic burnout. His throne was purchased by revolt, not inherited by tradition. Still, when Richard returned to England briefly for his coronation in September 1189, the country celebrated. Why? Because he wasn't John. And because after decades of internal collapse, England longed for a king who looked like one. Henry II's death marked more than the rise of a new king. It marked the beginning of the disintegration of the very empire he spent his life constructing. The vast territories of Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, and Normandy would soon be lost, most to Philip II of France. Richard, though brave, would die without a legitimate heir. John, the last son, would fumble the crown into war, rebellion, and ultimately, Magna Carta. The seeds of all these events were planted in Henry's final decade, in his failure to design a sustainable dynasty, in his refusal to relinquish real power, and in the unsolvable paradox of crowning multiple sons while refusing to give any of them sovereignty. He died a king. But his last words were not commands nor blessings. They were questions. Why had his sons turned? Why had God forsaken him? Why had loyalty become so rare? A hair shirt beneath royal robes. A Lionheart on the throne. An empire already beginning to crumble. The incense had barely cleared the rafters of Westminster Abbey when the blood began to flow in the streets. On September 3, 1189, Richard I was crowned King of England. The ceremony was dazzling gold-stitched vestments, foreign dignitaries, chants in Latin echoing through the nave. But outside the abbey, far from the gilded coronation canopy, a very different ritual was taking place. A pogrom. And it did not begin by accident. A king was crowned beneath crosses. But outside, crosses were used to justify knives. Richard, days before his coronation, issued an order. No women and no Jews were to be present at the ceremony. Why? Because he was about to take up the cross and lead the Third Crusade. And so, the image of ritual purity had to be enforced visibly, symbolically. But Jewish envoys, wealthy merchants from London, York, and Lincoln, had brought gifts as was customary for a new king. These weren't bribes, but traditional tributes, and a way of securing legal protection under the new monarch. Henry II had accepted such gifts. So had his father. Richard's courtiers turned them away. Some say they stripped and flogged the envoys at the abbey gates. Rumors spread fast in a city where most had never seen a Jew, let alone understood their legal status. The king has ordered the death of the Christ killers, some shouted. It wasn't true. But the mob didn't care. That night, Jewish homes were set on fire. Families were dragged into the streets. Men were murdered in doorways. Some were forced to convert under threat of death. What began as a local outburst in London metastasized into a national tragedy. Over the next several months, Norwich, the Jewish quarter, was raided. Stamford and Berry Street, Edmonds, Jewish communities were driven out. Lincoln, attacks broke out around Easter. York, March 1190, the most infamous massacre. In York, around 150 Jews sought refuge in Clifford's Tower, a royal castle. They were besieged by a mob whipped up by debt-holding nobles and local clergy. Realizing their fate, many committed mass suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. The survivors who surrendered were butchered anyway. The records tell us their names, their professions, the inventories of their debts. But we will never know their final prayers. Chronicler William of Newburgh wrote, "So long as there were Jews, there would be hatred. So long as there was debt, there would be knives." When word of the London riots reached Richard, he was reportedly furious. He issued royal writs reaffirming the Jews as servants of the crown, a legal category that meant their lives and property were under direct royal protection. He ordered executions of a few perpetrators, but most were never punished. Worse, he was gone within the year off to the Holy Land, leaving the Jewish communities exposed once more. The timing could not have been worse. Crusade propaganda had already demonized Jews as spiritual enemies alongside Muslims. Economic resentment against Jewish moneylenders was rampant, fueled by clerical preachers. And now, a king who had posed as defender of justice was gone, replaced by barons who owed debts they had no intention of repaying. Richard's absence meant that the rule of law became discretionary. Protection meant nothing without presence. And those who hated Jews didn't need royal permission, they just needed royal silence. Richard may have commanded battlefields, but he never truly controlled his kingdom. And when kings fail to act decisively, others will act decisively for them. The massacres of England's Jews weren't just an eruption of medieval intolerance. They set legal and social precedents that would haunt the kingdom for a century. Increased ghettoization of Jews across England. The creation of the exchequer of the Jews under John, to systematize loans and taxation, more surveillance than protection. A spiritual stain on Richard's legacy, which chroniclers would mention even when praising his exploits in Acre and Jaffa. Perhaps most tragically, these events foreshadowed the eventual expulsion of all Jews from England in 1290 under Edward I, an act made possible by the precedent that Jewish lives could be considered negotiable when power was elsewhere. The Lionheart was crowned with cheers. But in the alleys and cellars of London, screams echoed louder. and though Richard would raise the cross abroad, he left behind a kingdom where the blood of the innocent paved the road to the Holy Land. He left not as a king but as a warrior crowned in myth before he earned his scars. In July 1190, Richard the Lionheart, set sail from Marseille. His destination, the Holy Land. His purpose, to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin. His absence, nearly 5 years. And in that time, England would drift between fear and fraud, loyalty and rebellion. This was no ordinary expedition. It was the Third Crusade, and it was not just a clash of armies, it was a contest of legends. But behind the chivalric glow and shining mail, something far more fragile was unraveling. For while Richard waged holy war abroad, his kingdom at home began to rot from the inside. He conquered islands, breached cities, battled sultans but could not command the land he ruled. On his way to the Holy Land, Richard's fleet was scattered by storms. Several ships ran aground on Cyprus, ruled at the time by the Byzantine rebel Isaac Comnenos. Richard's sister Joan and his fiancée Berengaria of Navarre were among those stranded. When Isaac refused to release them, Richard launched a full-scale invasion. Within 3 weeks, Richard had conquered the entire island. He chained Isaac in silver shackles, a mockery of Isaac's boast that he would never wear iron. Cyprus became a critical crusader supply base for years to come. Surprising detail: Richard married Berengaria in Limassol, on Cypriot soil, making her Queen of England in a realm England barely knew. This wasn't just a military success. It showed Richard's brilliance in rapid logistics, improvisation, and naval coordination. But it also revealed something else. He was far more comfortable conquering foreign lands than ruling his own. When Richard reached the Holy Land, the siege of Acre had dragged on for nearly 2 years. The Crusaders were demoralized, plagued with disease, and leaderless. Richard, newly arrived and sick with scurvy, took command within days. He directed artillery bombardments, outmaneuvered Saladin's reinforcements, and forced the city to surrender. Thousands of Muslim defenders were taken prisoner. When Saladin delayed ransom negotiations, Richard ordered the mass execution of 2,700 prisoners outside the city walls. This decision haunts his legacy. Some called it military necessity, others an unforgivable atrocity. Either way, it sent a message. Richard played by no rules but his own, and mercy would not slow him down. Moving south toward Jaffa, Richard's army was harried relentlessly by Saladin's forces. Morale wavered. Then, on September 7, 1191, near the plains of Arsuf, Saladin launched a full cavalry assault. Richard held his lines until the last moment, then unleashed his heavily armored knights. The Crusader countercharge broke Saladin's elite troops, forcing a retreat. This was the only major pitched battle of the entire crusade. And Richard won it decisively. By spring 1192, Richard had recaptured Jaffa and stabilized the coastline. But Jerusalem remained out of reach. Every march toward it stalled logistics, internal divisions, and Richard's own sense that victory there would be unsustainable. The greatest irony of the crusade? Richard never entered Jerusalem. He came within 12 miles. Twice. He stood on Mount Scopus, saw the holy city glittering on the horizon, and turned back. Saladin's forces remained too strong. The Crusader coalition was fracturing. Richard knew that even if he captured the city, he could not hold it. And England, his fragile kingdom, was slipping further away. In September 1192, Richard signed a truce with Saladin. Christians retained control of the coastline from Jaffa to Tyre. Muslim control of Jerusalem was affirmed, but Christian pilgrims could safely enter. It was not a triumph, but it was a pragmatic peace, earned in blood, siege, and reputation. Richard began the long journey home. Richard had left England in the hands of two men, William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, and his chief justiciar, Hugh de Puiset, Bishop of Durham. But both were deeply unpopular. Longchamp in particular was resented for his arrogance, foreign birth, and heavy taxation to fund the crusade. Enter John, Richard's younger brother. He had been given lands but no title of power. Now he began to style himself as regent, holding court, seizing castles, issuing charters in his own name. The kingdom descended into chaos. Factions formed pro-Richard versus pro-John. Castles were seized without sanction. Local justice ground to a halt. Taxes mounted, not for governance, but for ransom because Richard had been captured on his way home. While crossing through Austria in disguise, Richard was recognized by Duke Leopold V, whom Richard had insulted at Acre. He was handed over to Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, who demanded a ransom of 150,000 marks, about 3 times the annual income of the English crown. John offered support to the emperor to keep Richard imprisoned. Meanwhile, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now nearing 70, rallied the kingdom to raise the funds. It would take until 1194 to bring Richard home. He rode with banners into the Holy Land. But in his absence, the law withered, justice died, and loyalty frayed. The Lionheart returned not to glory but to a realm that had survived him, and a brother who now dreamed openly of a crown. The Lionheart did not die in battle, nor in pilgrimage, nor even in the heat of crusade. He died on the ramparts of a minor castle, in a war that hardly mattered, fighting an enemy whose name barely survived. And yet, that crossbow bolt, loosed by a single defender of Calas-Chabrol, echoed louder than all of Richard's triumphs. On April 6, 1199, King Richard the First, warrior king, crusader, absentee sovereign, bled out from gangrene in the backwoods of Aquitaine. His final act was not a battle cry. It was to forgive the archer who killed him. But history has not been as kind, because that death unlocked a door that no one in England wanted to see opened. A crown passed not with cheers, but with clenched fists and worried hearts. For the realm knew this son of Henry was no lion. Richard's death is often mentioned in passing. He died at Calas in 1199. His brother John succeeded him. Richard was laying siege to Calas-Chabrol, a tiny fortress in Limousin, France, not because it was strategically vital, but because one of its lords had allegedly found a hoard of Roman gold and refused to hand it over. During the siege, on March 25, 1199, Richard was inspecting the walls without armor. A crossbowman named Pierre Basile shot him in the shoulder. The wound turned septic. By early April he knew he would die. In his final hours he ordered the archer spared, gave him 100 shillings and forgave him. Chroniclers were astonished. The warrior king, who had shown no mercy to Saracens or traitors, had found peace at the end from the least likely place, a faceless soldier defending his home. Yet in a cruel twist of fate, Pierre Basile was flayed alive and hanged by Richard's captain, against the king's explicit wishes. It was a grim omen. Mercy may have passed with the king. Richard died without a legitimate heir. His only surviving brothers were Geoffrey, who had died in 1186, father of Arthur of Brittany; John the youngest, once called Lackland, and the most distrusted. But the Angevin Empire didn't inherit like England. A contested succession immediately emerged. John was named heir in Normandy and England, supported by Eleanor of Aquitaine. But in Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, many barons backed Arthur of Brittany, Geoffrey's 12-year-old son. The realm began to fracture not on the battlefield, but in oaths, letters, and summoned courts. John had to act fast to cement power. John was crowned in the traditional fashion, but it lacked the pageantry of his brothers or fathers. He was in his early 30s, but his reputation was already well formed. Known for his inconstancy and loyalty. Viewed as duplicitous by barons and clerics alike. Nicknamed Soft Sword, a term both political and personal. Many barons took the oath of loyalty reluctantly, out of fear of continental chaos, not out of love for their king. One chronicler, Ralph of Coggeshall, wrote, "There was joy, but not without whispers. For in the eyes of many, the crown sat heavy on a brow already bent toward treachery." John had already tried to usurp Richard during his captivity in 1193. He had attempted alliances with Philip II of France behind his brother's back. He was known to seize baronial estates arbitrarily, often without legal process. John brought in foreign favorites, many of whom were reviled by the English nobility. He elevated mercenary captains and court flatterers, alienating traditional lords. Unlike Richard, who ignored England, John wanted to rule it directly but without sharing power. He was meticulous, jealous of authority, and had no tolerance for baronial independence. Eleanor of Aquitaine, still alive, propped up John's legitimacy, but her power worried the nobility. They feared a return to the domineering Plantagenet centralism of Henry II's days without the competence. Though John wore the crown, his rule began on shifting ground. Philip II of France immediately challenged John's right to French lands, backing Arthur of Brittany. In Aquitaine, discontent stirred against John's heavy-handedness. Even in England, murmurs began among barons about charters, rights, and taxation. John wasn't just inheriting a crown, he was inheriting a century of accumulated distrust, unresolved legal tensions, and the ghosts of his father and brother. And unlike them, he lacked charisma, strategic brilliance, and military aura. Richard died with a sword in his side and forgiveness on his lips. John ascended with doubt behind every bow and poisoned wine. Where the Lionheart inspired legend, John inspired ledgers. Tallies of grievances, taxes, and silent oaths of future rebellion. The crown had passed. But the kingdom did not cheer. It watched. He had the crown but not the certainty. From the moment John sat on the English throne in 1199, it was a rule weighed down by questions, whispers, and continental cracks that widened with every decision he made. He inherited an empire, not just a kingdom. But what he couldn't inherit was his father's iron grip or his brother's battlefield prestige. John Plantagenet was not feared. He was tested. And when kings are tested early, they either rise or break. In John's case, he broke the empire itself. A treaty signed with gold. A prince lost in the dark. Normandy gone, and with it, the illusion that John was ever in control. Faced with French aggression under Philip II Augustus, John opted for peace. At Le Goulet, a tiny island in the Seine, a deal was struck on May 22, 1200. John was recognized as rightful heir to all Angevin lands, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. In exchange, he ceded strategic fortresses, acknowledged Philip as overlord of these lands, and paid 20,000 marks. Most crucially, Arthur of Brittany, John's nephew and rival, was disinherited by Philip, at least on paper. Why did John sign it? Because he needed breathing room to secure his rule in England. Because he lacked the military force to hold against Philip. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother and most loyal supporter, was aging and unable to control Aquitaine much longer. But here's the twist. In trying to freeze the map, John actually signaled his weakness. By accepting vassalage to Philip, he invited future challenges to his sovereignty. Almost immediately after the treaty, John shattered its spirit with a scandal. He abducted and married Isabella of Angoulême, a 12-year-old heiress already betrothed to Hugh of Lusignan, a powerful Poitevin noble. This not only insulted the Lusignans, but destabilized Aquitaine, where John desperately needed loyalty. When the Lusignans protested, John seized their lands, summoned them to court, and when they refused, declared them in rebellion. They appealed to Philip II as their overlord. Philip summoned John to his court in Paris. John refused. And with that, the Treaty of Le Goulet was broken less than a year after it was signed. Philip declared John's lands forfeit and gave them to Arthur of Brittany, then aged about 15. Backed by Breton and Poitevin forces, Arthur marched on Mirbeau, where Eleanor of Aquitaine was staying. John's response was unexpectedly swift. He gathered a force of mercenaries, marched day and night, and surprised the besiegers. Arthur, along with many rebellious barons, was captured on August 1, 1202. It was John's greatest tactical success, but it would trigger his most disastrous moral failure. Arthur was imprisoned in Falaise Castle in Normandy. Rumors swirl about John's intentions. Some said John ordered Arthur blinded and castrated, an old practice to make rivals unfit to rule. Some say Arthur defied John to his face and struck him. Others claim John was drunk when he did it. In April 1203, Arthur disappeared. Contemporaries believe John murdered him personally, or had him drowned in the Seine. Chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall wrote, "After Easter, John's nephew Arthur was, it is believed, killed by his uncle's own hand. But God knows the truth. The political fallout was immense. Barons in Anjou, Maine, and Brittany defected en masse. Even previously loyal nobles refused to fight for a murderer of kin. John's moral legitimacy, already threadbare, was now shattered." Philip moved methodically. March 1204. Philip lays siege to Château Gallard, the fortress Richard had designed, the key to Normandy. John, instead of defending it personally, retreated to the south and delayed, hoping to regroup. After a brutal siege, the fortress fell in March 1204. One by one, the Angevin heartlands collapsed. Rouen opened its gates. Caen, Bayeux, and Avranches surrendered. By August 1204, Normandy was lost permanently. John would never set foot in Normandy again. This wasn't just a geopolitical defeat. It was a psychological turning point for England's elite. Normandy had been English since 1066. Its loss symbolized the decline of Plantagenet prestige. Many Anglo-Norman barons held estates on both sides of the Channel. Now they had to choose. They lost income, land, and influence. And they blamed John, not Philip, not fate. Even worse, John increased taxes in England to fund his efforts to retake the lands he lost and failed again and again. The barons began to see John not just as unlucky, but as dangerous to their prosperity. He signed away power to buy peace. He broke it for lust. He won a prince in battle and lost a kingdom through blood. Normandy was gone. Anjou lost. And in the smoking ruin of an empire, England braced itself. For this king, this John would not stop taxing, would not stop punishing, would not stop grasping. And the barons were running out of patience. As John turns homeward, the realm grows brittle. To pay for lost lands, he squeezes his kingdom like never before. And in the churches and castles of England, talk begins, not of rebellion, but of rights. The empire was gone. Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, all lost. But John still wore the crown, and in wearing it he vowed to take something back. Not land, not honor, money. And he didn't ask for it. He demanded it. What he could not win with a sword, John tried to seize with parchment and gallows. But gold cannot mend a broken oath. And prayers turned to silence. When Normandy fell in 1204, John didn't scale back. He ramped up. To fund a possible reconquest of his continental territories, he needed unprecedented revenue. And so he turned to the only thing still within his reach, his English subjects' pockets. John's financial weapons. Scutage, a payment in lieu of military service. It had been used before, but John demanded it far more frequently and at higher rates. In just a few years he levied scutage 10 times twice as often as any previous king. Tallage on towns and Jews. This was a non-negotiable levy imposed directly by the crown. Jewish communities, already vulnerable after Richard's coronation massacres, were taxed into desperation. When they couldn't pay, John imprisoned or expelled them and seized their assets. Inheritance fines. When a noble died, John manipulated the relief system, demanding exorbitant payments from heirs to inherit their family lands. In some cases, these were 5 to 10 times the customary amount. Forest fines. John extended the boundaries of royal forests where strict laws applied and fined those who broke them, sometimes retroactively. This wasn't taxation. It was legalized extortion. Normandy was gone. Anjou lost. And in the smoking ruin of an empire, England braced itself. For this king, this John would not stop taxing, would not stop punishing, would not stop grasping. And the barons were running out of patience. As John turns homeward, the realm grows brittle. To pay for lost lands, he squeezes his kingdom like never before. And in the churches and castles of England, talk begins not of rebellion, but of rights. The empire was gone. Normandy, Anjou, Brittany all lost. But John still wore the crown, and in wearing it he vowed to take something back. Not land, not honor, money. And he didn't ask for it. He demanded it. What he could not win with a sword, John tried to seize with parchment and gallows. But gold cannot mend a broken oath. And prayers turned to silence. When Normandy fell in 1204, John didn't scale back. He ramped up. To fund a possible reconquest of his continental territories, he needed unprecedented revenue. And so he turned to the only thing still within his reach, his English subjects' pockets. John's financial weapons. Scutage, a payment in lieu of military service. It had been used before, but John demanded it far more frequently and at higher rates. In just a few years he levied scutage 10 times twice as often as any previous king. Tallage on towns and Jews. This was a non-negotiable levy imposed directly by the crown. Jewish communities, already vulnerable after Richard's coronation massacres, were taxed into desperation. When they couldn't pay, John imprisoned or expelled them and seized their assets. Inheritance fines. When a noble died, John manipulated the relief system, demanding exorbitant payments from heirs to inherit their family lands. In some cases, these were 5 to 10 times the customary amount. Forest fines. John extended the boundaries of royal forests where strict laws applied and fined those who broke them, sometimes retroactively. This wasn't taxation. It was legalized extortion. Instead he prepared for war. The brilliance of John's enemies was their patience. They let him build his own case for rebellion brick by brick, with every fine, every miscarriage of justice, every insult to Rome. By 1213 England was financially exhausted, spiritually isolated, politically brittle. And John? He stood alone, no longer the heir of a conqueror, not a crusader, not a reformer, not even a king in God's eyes. When a king fears God, his people rejoice, wrote a chronicler. When a king taxes both soul and purse, they sharpen their knives. He taxed the dead, silenced the prayers, and emptied the coffers. He ruled not by law but by whim. And in silencing the church, he taught his barons something profound. If even the Pope could defy the crown, perhaps they could too. The King of England, excommunicated, defiant, and cornered, had no friends left, not on the continent, not in the church, not even in his own court. He had taxed the nobility to ruin, plundered the clergy, silenced the sacraments, and cast a long shadow of fear across the realm. But by 1213, that shadow was beginning to shrink, not because John grew weaker, but because others had begun to resist in broad daylight. And so, in a moment as theatrical as it was political, the once defiant king fell to his knees, not before barons, not before his people, but before the one power in medieval Europe still feared above any monarch, the papacy. This was not submission. It was a masterstroke of survival masquerading as penance. He could not face the barons, so he kissed the Pope's ring. In saving his soul, John sold his kingdom and made England a vassal of heaven. Popular history often glosses over John's submission to the papacy as either an act of religious repentance or humiliating surrender. But the reality is far more calculated and sinister. John didn't submit because he was pious. He submitted because he was out of options. By late 1212, John's position was collapsing. The French threat loomed large. Philip II of France, emboldened by John's excommunication and alliance failures, was preparing a full-scale invasion of England with papal blessing. Baronial unrest was cresting. With no legitimate outlet for their grievances and no faith in John's justice, they began covert communication and plotting. The kingdom had been under interdict for 5 years. No weddings, no funerals, no masses. The people, especially the lower clergy, grew desperate and angry. And crucially, John had no allies. Scotland looked on coldly. Wales was restless. His brother Richard was dead. His own nobility distrusted him. He was king, but he was isolated from every source of legitimacy. In early 1213, John opened secret negotiations with Pope Innocent III. And in May 1213 at Dover he made a public, theatrical concession. John accepted Stephen Langton, the very archbishop he had rejected for years. More than that, he surrendered the Kingdom of England and Ireland to the papacy, making it a papal fief. He pledged to pay an annual tribute of 1,000 marks to Rome. He swore fealty to Innocent III, not just as spiritual leader but as overlord. England, for the first time in history, was no longer a fully sovereign crown. It was now a vassal state of the Pope. 1. The excommunication was lifted. John was brought back into the church. Sacraments resumed. Bells rang again. The people could bury their dead. The interdict ended in July 1213. 2. Philip II's invasion was blocked. Innocent III, now John's lord, declared any attack on England to be an attack on the church itself. The French fleet, gathered in Boulogne, was scattered by a surprise naval strike from the English in August 1213, one of John's few tactical successes. 3. Stephen Langton arrived in England. And though John accepted him publicly, their relationship would be defined by suspicion and political rivalry, not peace. But what matters most is what didn't happen. The barons did not cheer. The people did not rejoice. The clergy did not wholly forgive. Because everyone understood what John had done. He had not protected England, he had sold it. John's submission to the Pope bought him time. It protected him from invasion and lifted the religious siege on his kingdom. But it came at a terrible cost. It confirmed what many barons feared, that John would side with foreign powers over his own people. It gave him the church's backing to suppress internal rebellion, using excommunication as a weapon against domestic foes. And it set a precedent that the English crown was not untouchable, not sacred, but politically subordinate to Rome. The papacy, which had once shielded kings, now held them by the throat. The bells tolled again. The altars lit again. But behind the incense, a bargain had been struck. The king was clean in the eyes of the church, but soiled in the hearts of his people. John had escaped Philip. He had escaped hell. But he had not escaped England. With the church behind him and the treasury full again, John overreaches. He tries to reclaim France. He fails. And back home, the barons begin to write their answer one clause at a time. Ready to follow the road to Magna Carta? He had survived the Pope. He had outmaneuvered the King of France. The bells of England rang again, and the churches no longer stood in silence. And yet in every great hall and hunting lodge from Lincolnshire to Kent, voices were growing colder. King John had made peace with heaven, but he had lost the earth beneath his feet. He was no longer excommunicated, but neither was he obeyed. For when a king fears his barons more than his enemies, rebellion becomes not an if but a when. The barons didn't rise against King John because they were hungry for power. They rose because John had taught them that no law constrained the crown, and no promise meant permanence. This wasn't revolution for ambition, it was revolution for survival. Flushed with papal approval and eager to recover his lost lands, John attempted one final campaign to retake Normandy. He rallied allies in Flanders and the Holy Roman Empire, and in 1214 launched his two-pronged attack. John invaded Poitou and Anjou from the south. His allies, including Otto IV, attacked Philip II from the northeast. But the plan failed catastrophically. On July 27, 1214, at the Battle of Bouvines, Philip crushed the imperial coalition. Otto fled. John's allies collapsed. The French gained prestige, John lost everything. This wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological disaster. John had taxed his kingdom to fund this war. Scutage, forced loans, Jewish levies, all spent for nothing. The barons who had reluctantly supported the campaign felt betrayed. You taxed us to fight for Normandy, they said, but all we bought was your failure. Back in England, John returned to intensified governance by terror. He resumed forest fines, expanding royal lands that hadn't been forests in years. He demanded scutage from every knight who had refused to join him in France, even those never summoned. He revived wardship extortion, seizing lands from heirs and widows. He dispatched mercenary captains, not English nobles, as his sheriffs and enforcers. The result? The traditional nobility, those with ancestral ties and local loyalties, felt replaced, disrespected, and dispossessed. One chronicler, Matthew Paris, captured the mood. He knew not justice but coin. He broke oaths like twigs. And from this, the kingdom groaned louder than the bells. In 1213, Archbishop Stephen Langton, finally allowed into England, began preaching not submission but limits. Drawing from Anglo-Saxon precedent, Langton reminded the barons of Henry I's coronation charter, 1100, which had promised protection of church rights, limits on feudal exploitation, a return to just law. Langton suggested this old charter could be revived, expanded, enforced. And the barons listened. They began to meet in private. They drew up lists of grievances. They drafted demands no longer informal but contractual. The language began to shift from complaint to covenant. The most vocal resistance came from the north. Robert Fitzwalter styled himself Marshal of the Army of God. Eustace de Vesey, Sacher de Quincy, and William de Mowbray joined forces. They weren't rebels in the beginning, they were petitioners. But John, as always, responded to negotiation with threat. And so, in January 1215, they formally renounced their fealty, seized London by May, and issued an ultimatum. Give us the law, or we will take the kingdom. From a historian's perspective, John didn't just misgovern, he redefined kingship as tyranny. Let's consider what he failed to do. He never summoned a great council to negotiate. He never confirmed feudal custom by oath. He never gave his barons predictability, neither in taxes nor in justice. He did not govern like a Plantagenet. He ruled like a capricious overlord, backed by mercenaries and fear. The barons, in turn, did something revolutionary. They demanded a king who was subject to law. Not because they were idealists, because they were cornered. He had escaped the church's wrath. He had silenced France for a moment. But now his kingdom itself had turned. These were not enemies from abroad. These were sons of knights, sworn men, sheriffs and lords. And they did not march for power. They marched for rules. And on a meadow by the Thames, they would force their king to listen. 1215. The barons arrive at Runnymede. The document they present will become the most famous charter in Western history. But even as the ink dries, war is coming again. The fires of rebellion had been lit not with swords but with parchment. What began as hushed murmurings among northern barons had become an open march, not on castles, not on manors, but on the very heart of the king's realm, London itself. And when the gates opened to them in May 1215 without a fight, it was not the victory of a mob. It was the arrival of an army that no longer believed in its king. The battle had not yet begun. But the king had already lost his capital. He thought the threat was in France. He thought the church would shield him. He thought the barons could be bought, scattered, or broken. But in the spring of 1215, John realized the one thing no tyrant wants to learn. The kingdom no longer feared him. John did not lose because of Magna Carta. He agreed to Magna Carta because he had already lost London. By spring, the rebel barons had grown to nearly 40 of the realm's most powerful lords. They were no longer outliers. They were the majority voice among the landed elite. In early May, they issued a formal demand for reform backed by force. John's response? Delay. He offered arbitration. He made vague promises. He summoned mercenaries from Poitou. But the barons saw through it. And then came the moment that changed everything. On May 17, 1215, the barons marched on London, and the city let them in. No battle, no siege, no bloodshed. The gates swung open and the capital declared for the rebels. The merchants, resentful of royal tolls. The clergy, angered by John's manipulation of the church. The townsfolk, weary of endless scuddage and feudal bullying. All of them sided with the barons. In the taking of London, wrote Roger of Wendover, the king's spine was broken though he still wore his crown. With London lost, mercenaries deserting, and papal support stretched thin, John had no choice but to negotiate. The two sides met in a damp meadow near the Thames Runnymede, midway between Windsor Castle and the rebel stronghold. There, over several days of heated deliberations, the Charter of Liberties was revised, expanded, and transformed into what we now call the Magna Carta. And on June 15, 1215, John placed his seal upon it. Not signed, it was sealed. And that difference matters. Because this wasn't a warm agreement. This was an act of coercion, a cornered king yielding to the collective force of his own nobility. As historians, we must avoid mythologizing Magna Carta into something it wasn't. It didn't create democracy. It didn't free the peasants. It didn't even last a year. But it did three revolutionary things. 1. Declared the king subject to law. No longer could royal will override established custom. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. Clause 40. 2. Created a council of enforcement. A group of 25 barons had the power to enforce the charter by force if necessary. This was unprecedented. 3. Bound taxation to consent. The king could no longer raise scutage or aid without the common council of our realm. It was the germ of parliamentary consent. Even more radical, these clauses applied not just to barons, but in many cases to all free men. In a society still defined by status and birth, that was a political earthquake. John didn't seal Magna Carta because he believed in reform. He sealed it because he was trapped. But his signature meant little. Even as he pressed his royal seal to wax, John was already plotting to revoke it. He wrote to Pope Innocent III, declaring that he had signed under duress and asking for annulment. In return, Innocent issued a papal bull declaring Magna Carta null and void, a sacrilege against royal authority. But that annulment came after the charter was issued, and history had already taken note. On the banks of the Thames, a king bent if only for a moment. His word was rotten, his promises paper thin. But the parchment they forced upon him would echo louder than his armies ever did. For in Runnymede green stillness, England glimpsed a different kingdom. Not one ruled by whim, but one ruled by law. But a charter cannot tame a tyrant. Within weeks, John renounces everything. The Pope declares the document void, and England once more descends into civil war. This time the rebels look to France for a king. On June 15, 1215, King John sealed the Magna Carta at Runnymede, a document forced from his hands, not given freely. To those present, it seemed the crown had finally bowed to law. But to John this was not a compromise. It was a humiliation, a pause in battle, a tactic. And to the Pope, who had only just restored John to Christian favor, it was heresy. The barons believed they had bound the king. But in truth they had only given him time. And behind their backs, John was reaching for the one seal greater than his own. Magna Carta didn't end tyranny, it delayed war. And worse, it gave John leverage. Because the moment he sealed that parchment, he played his next card, the Pope. John left Runnymede a humiliated man, but not a broken one. He knew the barons had not sought to depose him outright. They still believed in the monarchy, just not his monarchy. So John did what tyrants do best. He manipulated the letter of the law against its spirit. He claimed he had sealed the charter under duress, and according to medieval legal tradition, any contract signed under coercion could be nullified. I was forced, he told Rome. I never consented freely. I am your vassal. Help me undo this insult to kingship. And in Rome, Innocent III did not hesitate. In August 1215, Pope Innocent III issued a bull declaring Magna Carta null, void, and forever damnable. His words were not mild. We utterly reject and condemn this charter. It is not only shameful and demeaning, but illegal and unjust. It undermines royal authority and violates papal sovereignty. And with those words, the Pope did not merely cancel a political agreement, he blessed John's tyranny. Why would he do this? Because in John, Innocent had a vassal king, one who had pledged England and Ireland to the papacy. Because allowing lay nobles to restrict a consecrated monarch threatened the very foundation of divine kingship. Because the charter, in Innocent's eyes, was an act of rebellion against God's order. The barons had not just overstepped their role as subjects. They had tried to make the king accountable to mortals. And for the Pope, that was blasphemy. When the papal bull arrived in England by late September, John moved swiftly. He renounced Magna Carta entirely. He declared the barons traitors and began assembling mercenary forces, mainly Flemish and Poitevin soldiers. He demanded castles, hostages, and oaths from any remaining loyal barons. But this time the country did not comply. In the north and east, castles flew rebel banners. Towns locked their gates against royal garrisons. Even bishops once obedient began distancing themselves. John had overplayed his hand. By rejecting the charter, he had confirmed every fear the barons had voiced. Let's pause as analysts. Why did John believe the Pope's support would hold the realm? Answer: because he misunderstood the difference between spiritual authority and political reality. The papacy could bless, condemn, and excommunicate, but it could not enforce the king's rule in every village, shire, and stronghold. In fact, Innocent's condemnation of Magna Carta had the opposite effect in England. It galvanized baronial resistance. It alienated moderate bishops like Stephen Langton, who saw the charter as a pathway to peace. It confirmed that John's loyalty lay with Rome, not with his own subjects. The Pope had preserved John's soul. But in doing so, he crushed John's throne beneath papal indulgence. He thought a seal from Rome would silence England. He thought the Church could make rebellion disappear. But England was no longer a kingdom ruled by fear alone. The charter had not vanished, it had become a cause. And the barons, once petitioners, now sharpened their swords. Peace was broken, and civil war was coming. The ink had been declared void. The charter, burned in Rome's judgment, was no longer parchment, it was provocation. And with peace officially shattered, England did not drift toward war. It rushed. What followed was not just rebellion, it was an attempted regime change, something so radical it still rattles the foundations of English history. The barons were no longer asking for rights. They were asking for a new king. And that king was not English. The crown broke faith. The church broke law. And so the barons broke the kingdom. If John could not be bound by charter, they would bind him by conquest. The barons did not rebel because they wanted chaos. They rebelled because they believed there was no other way to restore order. John had violated Magna Carta. He had summoned foreign mercenaries. He was backed by a pope who ruled from afar. The kingdom as they saw it was already in foreign hands. Their answer? Bring in a different foreigner, one who listened, one they could shape. In late 1215, the rebel barons sent envoys across the Channel to Prince Louis, son of King Philip II of France. Why Louis? He had married Blanche of Castile, granddaughter of Henry II of England, giving him a blood claim however tenuous. He was popular among French nobles and viewed as competent, devout, and politically pragmatic. Most importantly, he was not John. Louis accepted. He promised to uphold the charter. He promised to respect the rights of the English church and barons. And he began preparing an invasion. This was no subtle maneuver. It was an open declaration of intent to seize the English crown. On May 21, 1216, Louis landed in Thanet, Kent, with an army of knights, siege engines, and naval support. The effect was immediate and stunning. London opened its gates. The barons hailed him as king in Westminster, though no coronation occurred. Winchester fell. Half of England's castles shifted allegiance. Even King Alexander II of Scotland came south to pay homage to Louis in person. This was not a raid. It was an occupation. Within months, more than two-thirds of England was under French control. John had become king of roads, rivers, and retreat. A sovereign in name but a fugitive in practice. John did not negotiate. He raided, burned, and devastated lands that supported Louis. Entire towns were torched. Crops were salted. Barons' families were imprisoned as hostages. In Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and the Midlands, he unleashed brutal scorched-earth tactics. His loyalist base shrank further. And then, nature struck. In October 1216, John crossed the tidal estuary known as the Wash, likely near Sutton Bridge. But he misjudged the tide. As he rushed ahead, his baggage train containing royal treasure, archives, even the crown jewels was swallowed by the sea. Chroniclers described it as divine punishment. A king literally losing his kingdom to the waters. John still had his seal. Still had the papacy. Still had a few castles. But what he lacked was the single thing no king can afford to lose: legitimacy. When barons pledge to a foreign prince. When London turns its back. When churches ignore your rule and people cheer your enemy. You are no longer a monarch. You are a man wearing a crown. And John, in the final weeks of 1216, had begun to understand this. He became paranoid, fevered, and erratic. He refused counsel. He trusted no one. His final days were spent not governing but hiding. The barons had gambled with a foreign prince. The king had gambled with the wrath of his realm. Now England was torn city against castle, oath against oath. But before the final blow could fall, John's own body would betray him. October 1216. The tyrant dies, but his son is only 9. The French still hold the capital. Can a child king save a broken crown? And can Magna Carta live again, not as rebellion but as law? Let's follow the last breath of King John and the unlikely rise of Henry III, England's boy king. He rode like a man possessed, not to lead a kingdom, but to outrun the consequences of his rule. By the autumn of 1216, John of England was no longer a king in command. He was a haunted figure, retreating through a countryside where rebellion had become routine, where his name stirred more curses than prayers. The war he started had consumed the kingdom, and now it was consuming him. But in the end, it was not the French sword or a baron's blade that struck the final blow. It was the sea. When kings die, they often fall in battle. Some are assassinated, others outmaneuvered. But John Plantagenet drowned his crown in mud and salt. The jewels didn't just vanish, they represented everything John had tried to cling to: power, legacy, control. And they were taken not by enemy hands, but by the natural world itself. The land rejected him. And then the sea finished the work. In mid-October, with Prince Louis of France tightening his grip on the southeast, John aimed to cross from King's Lynn in Norfolk to Lincolnshire, hoping to regroup with his remaining loyalist forces at Newark. It was a rushed, unwise crossing through the Wash, a coastal estuary known even then for its deceptive tides and deadly mudflats. His baggage train, loaded with gold, jewels, royal documents, and possibly the original royal seal, followed a route near Sutton Bridge. But the tide, as it always does in the Wash, came faster than expected. As the wagons lurched through the mud, the waters surged in. They were swept away. Carts, horses, chests, all buried in the estuary's quicksand and tide. The crown jewels were never recovered. John did not wait. This wasn't merely about material wealth. Medieval kingship was theater as much as rule, and royal regalia held sacred symbolism. To lose the crown and scepter was more than an embarrassment. It was to lose the divine instruments of kingship itself. John had already lost. Normandy to Philip of France. London to the rebel barons. Legitimacy to his annulled charter. Popular support to French occupation. Now he lost the physical emblems of monarchy. The king who had sold his soul to the Pope, wrote Roger of Wendover, now lost the earth beneath his feet and the gold of his ancestors, to the wrath of God and sea. Already weakened from exhaustion and poor morale, John's health deteriorated rapidly in the days following the disaster. On the march to Newark Castle, he suffered a violent fever and severe gastrointestinal distress, likely brought on by dysentery, worsened by stress, poor hygiene, and the harsh travel conditions. Some chroniclers claim he gorged himself on raw peaches and beer. Others hint at poison, though that remains unproven. What is certain, by October 18, 1216, he was dying. He made his will at Newark, naming his 9-year-old son Henry as his heir. He expressed repentance. He ordered debts paid. But he knew what was coming. Historians often debate John's capabilities, his legal reforms, administrative efforts, or intelligence. But no list of skills can compensate for a truth his own reign revealed. A king who cannot command loyalty will command nothing at all. John's undoing wasn't solely the barons. It wasn't Louis. It wasn't the Pope. It was his own insatiable suspicion, his abuse of power, and his unwillingness to be bound by anything not God, not custom, not law. By the time the sea swallowed his crown, he had already lost the substance of rule. All that remained was the form. And soon even that would be gone. The waves did not judge him. They simply came. the tide that could not be bribed, delayed, or deceived. And as it swallowed his treasure, it revealed the emptiness of his crown. A king died days later, unmourned by many, unloved by most. But the boy he left behind would inherit a country ready to tear itself apart. October 19, 1216. The tyrant dies. A boy of 9 becomes king. But how do you hold a crown when your enemies control half the kingdom? And can a regent salvage peace from the ruin? Next, we witness the birth of Henry III's reign and the quiet redemption of Magna Carta. A king was gone. A child took his place. And the parchment once rejected by the crown would now save the crown itself. John's final days were fevered, erratic, and steeped in regret. He arrived at Newark Castle in the heart of contested territory on October 18, gravely ill. Modern historians suggest he died of dysentery, perhaps worsened by emotional collapse and the loss of his treasure in the Washington. Some sources add an almost poetic grotesquerie, that his body swelled and blackened, a monarch dissolving in real time. His final acts included naming his son Henry, then just 9 years old, as his heir, appointing a council of regency led by the loyal, capable William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, recommending clemency for former enemies and admission that vengeance had left him a kingdom in ruins. Chronicler Matthew Paris would later write, "Hell itself is too foul a lodging for so foul a guest." Yet even in this contempt, there is a strange truth. John's death was not the end of a chapter, it was the opening for reconciliation. Let us be clear, John's demise didn't change baronial demands. It changed the perception of threat. With John gone, the barons could negotiate with a clean slate. There was no tyrant to fear. No excommunications. No arbitrary arrests. No French invasion seemed necessary anymore. And critically, the crown was now a child. Henry III posed no menace. His regent, William Marshal, was widely respected even among former rebels. He had fought in the Crusades, served under 5 monarchs, and commanded trust as few others could. Marshal and his allies understood something John never did. To rule England was to govern with the barons, not over them. Just 9 days after John's death, Henry was crowned not in London, which was under rebel control, but in the Cathedral of Gloucester, using a makeshift crown, either a simple circlet or a relic from the abbey treasury. The symbolism was powerful. A child king not yet corrupted by the politics of betrayal. A modest coronation, not a grand performance, but a plea for unity. A monarchy wounded but still breathing. "He is too young to sin," Marshal reportedly told the barons. "Let us not punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty." Within weeks, William Marshal and the Regency Council reissued the Magna Carta, carefully edited for survival. Church rights were reaffirmed. Feudal grievances were addressed. The Council of 25 Barons, the enforcement clause that so infuriated John and the Pope, was omitted, to soften its challenge to royal authority. This was no longer a document forced at sword point. It was a royal gesture of goodwill. And it worked. Moderate barons defected from Louis. The church, now led by the pragmatic Cardinal Gualabicchieri, blessed the new regime. Even rebel-held towns began to negotiate terms. The war did not end overnight. Prince Louis still held significant territory. But his coalition was cracking. On May 20, 1217, at the Battle of Lincoln, Marshal led a loyalist army to a decisive victory over French forces. The town was sacked, but the crown stood firm. In August, a French fleet bringing reinforcements was defeated at Sandwich, ending any hope of recovery. On September 11, the Treaty of Lambeth, or Kingston, was signed. Louis renounced his claim to the English throne in exchange for amnesty for his English supporters and a promise of safe passage home. The war was over. The French were gone. The charter remained. Magna Carta had failed in 1215 because it came too late to reconcile king and kingdom. But in 1216 to 1217, it succeeded because the king was new, innocent, and malleable. The regents were trusted, skilled at diplomacy and war. The rebels had no appetite for endless French rule. What began as a rebel manifesto became a national covenant. He left behind ruin, rebellion, and a royal seal lost to the sea. But John's death gave England something he never could: a chance. For a boy would wear the crown, and under him the charter would rise again. Not as resistance but as law. And so the war that broke a king built a monarchy that would outlast them all. What happened to young Henry? What became of the Magna Carta in later centuries? And how did one meadow in 1215 echo through revolutions, parliaments, and empires? Stay with us, because this is just the beginning of England's legal monarchy. He never signed it. It wasn't even called Magna Carta at the time. It was simply the charter, a desperate political ceasefire, a list of demands, and a parchment meant to be forgotten. And yet, it survived. Because embedded within its Latin clauses, tangled between customs, forests, debts, widows, and wardships, lay an idea so radical that even the chroniclers of the day didn't dare declare it revolutionary. But centuries later we would. Because this was the moment when law, not bloodline, began to define the English crown. The barons thought they'd won a war. What they'd really done was plant the seed of every future one. Let's first disarm the myth. As modern readers, we are conditioned to think of Magna Carta as a founding document, a kind of medieval constitution. But this is a 19th century reinterpretation. In its original form, it was neither philosophical nor idealistic. It was transactional, temporary, and above all feudal. But what made it endure was not its perfection, but its imperfection captured in writing. It wasn't a document of triumph. It was a record of distrust, and that's why it mattered. Of the original 63 clauses, only 3 remain part of English law today. But the following excerpts illustrate why this charter, flawed as it was, reverberated across centuries. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This is not a full defense of universal liberty. It refers to free men, a minority. But it is the first written instance in English law asserting that no one, not even the king, is above due process. Clause 39 became the skeleton of habeas corpus, jury trial, and due process in both British and American legal systems. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. This wasn't high-minded altruism. It was a swipe at John's infamous practice of selling justice to the highest bidder, especially in land disputes. The barons weren't demanding equality. They were demanding predictability and the elimination of royal extortion. But again, in hindsight, this clause foreshadowed modern expectations of impartial courts and access to legal remedy. No scutage nor aid shall be imposed, except by the common council of our kingdom. This doesn't mean Parliament, not yet. But it plants the idea that taxation must involve consent, not just royal decree. Though William of Malmesbury was already dead by the time of Magna Carta, he died around 1143, his writings laid the intellectual groundwork for chroniclers who followed. He didn't witness the charter, but he foreshadowed it. His Historia Novella contains this prescient reflection on royal overreach. Nothing burdens a people more than a ruler who fears none. Malmesbury believed in reform, not revolution. His concern was not rebellion, but the decay of royal restraint. Had he lived into John's reign, he likely would have viewed Magna Carta not as a threat to kingship but its rescue. By contrast, Roger of Wendover, writing after 1215, gives us the earliest full narrative of Magna Carta's birth. From his Florus Historiarum, Hay demanded that the king grant them the laws of old, and when he resisted, the realm was shaken like the sea. Wendover, no radical, still chronicled the barons as patriots. He recorded John's duplicity, the interdict, the French invasion, and the loss of the crown in the wash, not with mockery but with moral clarity. He preserves what the Charter's Latin fails to say outright, that this was a crisis not of policy but of principle. At the time, Magna Carta was repudiated, reissued, and manipulated. It was political theater. But over generations, it became a text of memory, and its meaning matured. In 1216 it was a bandage for civil war. By 1258, during the provisions of Oxford, it became a precedent. By 1297, Edward I incorporated parts of it into statute law. By the 17th century, Sir Edward Coke used it to confront the divine right of kings. And by the 18th century, it would be cited by American revolutionaries as a pillar of rights. In other words, it didn't change the world in 1215, but it gave future generations the language to demand change. It was written in haste, sealed under duress, forgotten then revived. But a line in Latin became a lifeline for liberty. And though its authors never dreamt of parliaments or presidents, they left behind the idea that even kings must bow, not to men, but to law. From the death of Henry I to the birth of Henry III, England did not merely pass through a civil war. It passed through a crucible. And what emerged was not just a stronger monarchy but a kingdom learning to question it. This was only the first century of that long and uneasy relationship between crown and people. And the echoes of Runnymede are far from silent. England didn't rise because of her kings, she endured in spite of them. If you felt the weight of this journey from oath-breakers to child kings, from blood-soaked cathedrals to drowned crowns, then you already know. History isn't past. It's warning. Subscribe to this channel for more untold truths, forgotten battles, and the stories that still shape us. Because the fight between power and justice never really ended.